It's been a while for my Let's Build with JavaScript series, so I'm going to contribute to that with another video. This one's kind of a little more advanced, but it is one that I think is something you see in the wild quite a bit. It deals with just basically dynamic checkboxes in a list or a series of list items, and oftentimes you want to select one or maybe many by shift clicking and selecting. And through that, you can actually, disable and enable these checkboxes like dynamically. So instead of just having to go through and check each one by one, you can kind of give the user a little more control over what they're doing. The same is true for like a select all and this clear button instance. So it's something that I've implored. It's pretty simple, but there is a little more advanced side to it with like the shift click to select multiples. So we'll get into that. But this video will kind of cover the bases. There's certainly some edge cases that aren't handled here, so I invite you to kind of take it and extend this, but I'm going to use CodePen to kind of get this going. So this is the end product. As you can see, there's some styles associated with it, as well as just dynamic stuff in terms of getting things checked and cleared and so on and so forth. So let's get started. I'll probably just kind of go quick with the HTML and CSS side of this, just because I feel like you're here for the JavaScript side of it. And I'll link this CodePen to the video or blog post as you're reading it, so don't fear. So the basic HTML might steal, honestly, from this existing version. I have another version I created already, and it's going to be just a basic markup pattern, kind of resembling the pattern maybe Bootstrap employs, but with some bells and whistles. So we're going to use a label and an input for each checkbox, and we can use this for and ID selector for each that allows even clicking on the label to select the checkbox. So that's kind of a nice built-in that HTML gives us. If you don't have the for and ID and they don't match, as you can see, the label clicking mechanism would not work. So you'd have to click on the checkbox directly, which is kind of cumbersome in the end. So it's a nice to have and probably more semantic thing to use. Up here is going to be a checkbox that's going to be a select all. This is clear checked button right here. Or no, this is the select all button right here. So this doesn't do anything yet, but essentially it will go through and check if any of these are checked. If not, it will check them all. And then we have a button at the very top to clear the entirety of any checked item, and then a span tag in the middle that will kind of count how many are checked in the end. So it's kind of a nice to have for the user in the end. So the same is true for the CSS. There's a few things I'll go through with how to get where we're at, and you'll have to let me know if you prefer me to go through step by step with the CSS and HTML side of these things. I feel like maybe it's necessary, but sometimes it's not. Here I'm using tables, as you can see, which everyone frowns upon these days, but they're actually really nice for data and listing elements and stuff like that. So within each is a published div, which encases the input type checkbox and label. And the reason for that is so I can select a state within the published tag, display it a certain way, and then kind of just fix it up from there. So we have an input type checkbox checked plus label. This allows us to kind of decorate a actual checked item. That's the input type checkbox has to be before the label for this to work. But allowing you to use CSS to kind of decorate that label once you do select that checkbox. So it's kind of a good practice to employ in terms of creating a visual state that you wouldn't otherwise have with basic HTML. I'm loading just a Google font to give a different font in our project here, that a basic container width and height and margin and so on and so forth. The background is a peach puff color. You can choose whatever color. Our table has some basic styling. Border collapse is kind of a good to have there. Then we style each TH in the T head, which is like this part here, to have that thicker border bottom. And each TD and TH, which are these things, have some padding and some border on the top. And then you can't, at the moment I just turned off selections because it's, want to highlight the text. Maybe you do though. It's probably something you might undo. And then the title itself stands out because it's a different type of font. Other than that, it's basic styling. So that button that's here, we kind of just gave it a basic default look and feel. It has a little hover state. And then the published div, which is this bit here, this block, has some display flex and align items properties just to give it a better look and feel. And the label inside, as I said, is more of a different font. So CSS is pretty basic. Where this goes further is the JavaScript. So let's get into that. So the way I've been writing JavaScript is maybe differ from some other folks. I like to kind of use an object-oriented approach. So you create a basic containing object that you can access its properties within using ES6. So what that looks like is I'll set like a variable and I'll say dynamic checkboxes equals an object. So just basic object. And you can namespace this to be something global if you want. I won't go into that, but that's just something you could do. Within that, we'll have properties we can assign on the object that could be, say, something that you're going to use within the methods inside of it. So methods could look like initial, something like so. And this is ES6, so if you're in ES5, you'd probably write something like this. Or ES whatever before 6. But the shorthand now you can do is this. So you might run that through Babel or something if you're using this in production. Initially, I'm going to set this initialize function that's going to basically set up this object to go ahead and do stuff when we go ahead and call it at the very end. So you'd actually call it just like you would any other function in your project. So dynamic checkboxes .initialize, and that essentially calls the function within the object. So we could say testing or something like that. Let's see what our, there it is right there. So cool. So that's working. And I'll be adding more functions to the mix. So those are just comma separated within this object. And you could just kind of continue on and share properties within each. So this is more of a functional approach, which allows you to kind of extract things in their own smaller functions and reuse them later. This could be heavily extended into something more dynamic where you actually use classes and import them with ES6 and so on and so forth. But for this project, I think it's pretty simple to go ahead and just use as is. So what I will do is start with the shift to select checkboxes. Is probably the most complicated portion of this. So I'll create a new function called shift to select. So within it, we need an instance of all the checkboxes in this. We need to know how many are on the page and then kind of listen for those when they're checked. So to get that, I could just go make a variable here, say const checkboxes, and do a query selector all. And we could just say like a table. I'll do it scope to the table. So td input. Just in case it were used somewhere else, you'd have to have the table checkbox. So that gives us our checkboxes. If we do console.log checkboxes, and the trick here is I use this initialize method to initialize any other functions within this file. So it's kind of just a global place to go ahead and set those up. So you'd say this, which refers to this actual object. And then you can call that function. So shift to select. And then if we go ahead and console log this, it might help if you go document.query selector all. There we go. So now I get a node list back with all those inputs, which are exactly what we want. So the key here is I'm going to be using this checkboxes variable everywhere else probably, or at least refer to it in a few other functions. And what I like to do is go ahead and just define that on the object. So checkboxes, now the syntax is different here, but the same properties are present, I guess you could say. The key difference here, instead of ending with a semicolon, is you end with a comma, because each property here is just like one of these here. So with that, we can get rid of the const there and just say this, which refers to dynamic checkboxes. So that should give us the same result, which is the node list, as you can see. So pretty cool. That's a little more reusable. So at any time in any function, I could say this.checkboxes and get this query selector all pattern. So I wanted to type that inside of each function, even though if you do need to, you could. It's just a little more reusable in my opinion. Okay, so this one's more advanced of the functions. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable just because I don't want to type this.checkboxes because we need that reference to this, which you'll see in a minute, which goes away. And then we're going to have a let last checked. variable, and it's let because that's going to change, and const is a variable that shouldn't change. So think of it as a constant. It stays the same. Let is the opposite. It's a variable just like var is, but you can do certain scoping with it, but it can change. So the key here is we're going to set a event listener. So we're going to take checkboxes dot for each, and each checkbox will do kind of an ES6 syntax here, and just do checkbox dot add event listener, and it will be click. And then within a click event, you can either call anonymous function and return it here, or just create another function to handle that. So I'll just say handle check in this case. Keeps it a little cleaner. So here we're looping through every checkbox and running this event listener. And you can actually use click on a checkbox, which is nice. So what we'll do is say function handle click. And we're going to listen for that event since it comes through automatically in this event call. So you get that for free when you pass one through an event listener like so. On top of that, we need to go ahead and I'll just comment out like check if shift key is down, and check if checkbox is checked. It's a lot of checking. So set a new variable called in between, which will basically listen between any looping mechanism to find the checkbox we're after. This is probably confusing, but let me go through this code and I'll show you. We're going to say if event.shiftKey and this.checked. We'll say checkboxes. We're going to loop through them again. Dot for each checkbox, and we'll do a fat arrow, but we'll open brackets this time. And then we do another if checkbox is equal to this. So this changes relative to the event click. So here, this refers to our object, but this refers to the key event listener that's coming through this click event, if that makes sense. So anytime you do that in an event listener, the value of this changes to what that event is. So it's kind of hard to get your head around, but that is how that works at this point. So we want to check if it's equal to that if click event, or the checkbox is equal to the last checked. And then we'll open those braces and we'll set in between here to equal the inverse of itself. So this is a dynamic way to do this rather than going through each checkbox, listening if it's checked. If it's checked, you do an else statement. This is kind of the dynamic approach I've seen in the wild. It is confusing as all hell, but it seems to work pretty well. So on top of that, we need to say if in between, we'll say checkbox dot checked equals true. Finally, at the very end of this line, we'll say let last check equals false, or this, excuse me. So this is going to refer again to the click event. So that's super confusing, but it should allow us to handle what we're after if I've done everything correctly here. So looks like checkbox is not defined. Why? Checkbox is checkbox. That might help. Handle check is not defined. I think it should be this. Or wait, did I spell it wrong? Handle check. Sorry guys. And I think that's it. So let's clear this to make sure if I save again, we don't get any more errors. There we go. So if I shift click, we get that concept there. So that's pretty sweet. So walk back through. So we're checking if the event is the shift key and this is checked. So this refers to basically if the checkbox is clicked. We'll go ahead and loop through each of the checkboxes. And if the checkbox is equal to the click event, or if the checkbox is equal to the last checked, so last checked is just a basic variable up here, we'll just set the inverse of in between to each. So that basically says in between your click and holding shift where you end up clicking, we'll set the inverse of the checked item. So it sounds like a handful, but it's just saying I'm going to check everything in between where you click first while holding shift and up until where you click at the end. And then we'll just say if that's a valid thing, we'll go ahead and check those checkboxes, which we're looping through. And then the last checked refers to the click event as well. So that's probably the hardest part of this. If it doesn't quite make sense, maybe, go through it a couple times and see, maybe console some stuff out. But that's the gist. So you can go ahead and shift through each of these and deselect at will. So pretty cool. So none of this functionality at up the top, clear, checked, or select all works. That's something that's probably a nice to have. Now we can do that next. I'll do the select all version. So select all. Just create another function. And this is going to end up being called on its own at the initialize method. So I'll just go ahead and call it just so we don't forget. All right. And at the very bottom in the function, we'll want to go and basically do another event listener, but we're going to bind it to the object itself. So the way that works is we'll say first we need to get that select all target. So if you recall in our HTML, we have an input at the very top right here called select all. I gave it a JS select all class. We need a way to grab that, so we still need to query the document for it. Just like I did before, you probably only use this once, but I'll go ahead and just add it in the object space. So I'll say all target is what I'm going to call it. And then I'll just say document query selector. And it's going to be js.select all. Remember the comma there. Okay, with that done, this should be initialized and ready to roll. Any logic we pass through, we should be able to run. So we can basically access that query selector function we just added through this. And this again refers to the dynamic checkboxes object. So this is going to go ahead and find that. So we'll say select all target, since that's the name we gave it. And we'll add an event listener. And this will be a click event again. And we'll give it another function. We'll just say handle select all. The key here, and something that's hard to grasp your head around again, is handle select all. Let's go ahead and create this function real quick. So at this point, if we were to, let's say console.log this, I'll show you what happens. So let's go ahead and find the console. Let's click this and we get the input select all, which is fine. I want the reference to the actual object there though. I want it to be bound to that. So the trick to doing that within an event listener is called bind. And the way you can do that is to bind the reference of this outside of the scope of this function. So say if I console.log this here, we're going to get the object, as you can see. So that's everything in the dynamic checkboxes object. So those are two instances just outside of the scope of that function. So scope is a big key here. Now this, I know the keyword this is confusing, but the way it works within an event listener is that once you pass a function through like so, this changes to the instance of what you clicked on. So in our case, it will be this changes from the object of the whole application we're doing to the actual input select all. So a way to get around that and still bind it to the object, which is what I want, is to go ahead and call .bind this. And that'll change the console log. Let me clear this to the object. So you see that click event changed. So if we were to remove this, it goes back to the actual event that was clicked on, so the JS checkbox. But if I add that back, we get the object. So hopefully that makes a little sense. So .bind and then passing the value of this through will allow you to pass that through to the function you're calling in this sense. So instead of like the old way of setting like a variable to self equals this, you don't have to do something like that anymore. You can kind of just pass it through with bind. At least that's how I do it. I'm not saying it's the be all end all. Okay, so with that done, we can go ahead and handle this select all logic. And all we're going to do is say this, since this refers now to the object, we can go ahead and find our checkboxes, query selector all instance, loop through each of those, and we'll say checkbox again. And we'll say just the ternary operator here. So we'll say if checkbox is checked, we can say if it's checked, basically do checkbox dot checked equals false, else box dot checked equals true. And you might want to wrap these in parentheses just to give it a little love. Okay. So that's saying if the checkbox checked in this case, we'll set the checkbox to false. Otherwise, we'll set it to true, just kind of doing a select all instance. So there's some edge cases there that might pop up, but I'm going to leave that as is. But essentially at this point, we can go ahead and do this and we get all of our checkboxes checked. So that's as quick and easy as it is to do so. Great. So what if we want to use this clear checked option to kind of check if there are any selections? If there are, we'll show that button. If not, we'll go ahead and remove it. So what I did is extracted some things into other functions to get this kind of a little more reusable. But what I'll do is I'll start with the basic concept of one. What I did first is create another function that's going to just be kind of a helper function. So I'm going to say clear button display. And it's going to pass in the state of the button we want. So all I'm going to do is basically just toggle some styles. So clear button. We don't have an instance of clear button yet, I know. So we'll get that in a second. Style.display equals state. That just gives us a way to say, if I call this function clear button display, I can just say like display flex or none or block as you would in CSS, you know. So that's that quick and easy win to kind of make that more reusable. So to get this rolling, we still need that clear button instance though. So let's get that first. So say clear button. I call the class JS clear in the HTML. It should be at the very top right here. And there is a span tag in between, so if you don't have that, make sure you do. So we're going to create a new method called this clear check. Kind of be the brains behind the whole mechanism. So let's go ahead and make that. I need a way to get all of these instances of the checkboxes, remove them. I also want to set the select all instance to be unchecked. And then finally remove the button state. So when I click this, these all should uncheck, this should uncheck, and then this should hide. It doesn't do anything yet. So let's do those now. So what I want to do is make basically another event listener. So this dot clear button, we just established where that clear button came from. And we'll say add event listener. And another click event. And then we'll say a function remove clicked or remove checked. And this one we do want to bind like we did the other one. So I want the reference of the object to pass through. And you can pass false here too if you want. Just go ahead and do so. These could probably all have false. So that's the event listener. We need to fire this remove check function now. And that could be another object-based class or a function, but we could also just do it in here. So just to kind of make it local. So remove checked. So what we're going to do is say this dot checkboxes. This is why we pass the binding through, so we have access to the object. For each, we do like a shorthand one-liner here. So checkbox, and we'll say checkbox basically just deselect anything that's checked. So if I were to select all here, those do uncheck now. Cool, but this, as you notice, this one doesn't, and this is still present. We don't have a count for the amount either, which will come up soon. So, and we can kind of do dual duty here and just say this dot select all target dot checked equals false. Just explicitly set that to false. And then this dot clear button dot style dot display equals none, or we could use that this dot clear button display and just pass through none. It allows us to use this reusable pattern. So it's probably the same amount to type, but it's just less, maybe more modular. So with that, we still need the reference of removing the actual check button. If I were to select all, clear checked, that does work. But what if we want the count and stuff in that picture? And now notice if I check this, that button isn't showing. It should show. So let's do that now. So we'll say show remove. We'll just do like show remove checked button. And there's no particular order you can like have these in. It might make sense to extract them into some sort of logical order. Sometimes alphabetical works. For some, others just like throw them in there. It gets spaghetti code in the end, so that's why some of these frameworks are popular. This stuff gets very modular and reusable, so you can import it and whatnot. So I'm approaching this very vanilla. So what we'll do is say this dot clear button display, call that helper function, and we'll say none again. And we'll say document dot add event listener. Notice it's at the document level, and I'm listening for change events. So this could be scoped to something else in the document if you want. It could be within like a whole form or whatever you're going to have piped through. But since this is kind of a global thing, I'm just going to go ahead and use it on the document level. And then we can call this dot show button, which is going to be a new function I create, and we'll bind this to true, or excuse me, this. And we'll need, I think, one more selector, or we need to actually initialize one more function, which will be this dot show remove. That's this function here. We have access to that within the object. And then within that, we're calling it another function, which is going to be called show button, which has more logic in it, which is why I extracted it initially. And we'll pass the event through. Notice we have that available to us since we're doing this event listener of change in the mix. So that gives us that power. So what I'll do is do another query selector of the same checkboxes we've been using, but we want to check if they're checked. And you can do that with CSS. So while this isn't quite reusable, I'll go ahead and just use it within this function and call it checkboxes check. So document query selector all. And we'll go and pipe through the table, TD. We want specific checkboxes input. If I can type checkbox, and then we can do a colon checked, which gives us the property, but we want the length of those. So dot length gives you the number coming back of that instance. So it'll return a node list like a normal, but we can get a length value off of that node list since we're doing a query selector all. All right, so with this variable now we can say if console, or excuse me, checkboxes checked is greater than 0. So if there's any type of these are selected, any one of these selected, that button should display is what we're going for. So say this dot clear button dot query selector span. We'll also just update the count in real time. We could just do span and set the text content equals to checkboxes checked, since we already have that instance of the length. And at the same time, we'll display the button. And then else, so we want it to kind of show and hide if these things are true or false. So clear button dot query selector span. Empty string there. And then we'll just do the inverse. So clear button is none. Okay, so it's a lot of code, I realize, but it does get the job done. So if we get this, that's great. If we get this, great. Looks like I maybe made a typo somewhere. Maybe not. Let's see what I did. It should be updating in real time, but right now it's not. Condole, might help if I spelled that right. Console.log. So we're not getting an actual incremented value. That's interesting. We're just getting click events. So this needs to be something. Document.query selector all table TD input. Oh, TD isn't a class. That would help. Let's try that again. Let's see if this increments. 1, 2. Yeah. See, now we get the button 2. So typo, but that does work, as you can see. So we get the incremental value as we're getting the checked about length. And then if any is checked, we'll show that button. If there's none, we'll hide it. So the same is true if all selected, if one selected, and you could get that updated count in that span tag too, which is nice. So this is at the document level. I'm listening for that event on this function. So any type of change, we'll find it. It's kind of taxing of a query, but it is something that works. So then we're calling this function with all this logic in it, but binding this to it as well. That allows us to kind of call this inside of it so we can query for these instances we've already passed to the object. So quite a mouthful, but quite a little bit of code, less than 100 lines to get that decent amount of functionality into your app. So there's obviously ways you can extend this and make it more performant and reusable, but I think this captures what I was trying to display and show you guys. So if you have questions or comments, definitely let me know. Feel free to steal this code and use it in your app. You might refactor it into the way you like to write. I prefer this kind of object approach because I can chain it to other things or share data, so on and so forth. This is kind of an older school approach. With ES6, you could like import a lot of these functions or export them as defaults and stuff and go wild. But this is the kind of straight up HTML, JavaScript, and CSS approach. So hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, would appreciate a thumbs up or a like. If you want to see more, let me know, and I will see you guys next time. All right, peace. Hello Rails is my new course on Ruby on Rails. I'll teach you Ruby on Rails from the ground up. Visit hellorails.io for more information.